The Exilari Empire had ruled the galaxy for centuries, not through brute force, but through absolute control. Their mind control serum was perfect, an unstoppable tool that had turned countless civilizations into obedient servants. No species had ever resisted it. With a single injection, thoughts of rebellion vanished. Loyalty to the Empire became absolute, and free will disappeared like smoke in the wind. It was their most powerful weapon. And now, they had decided to use it on humanity. The Exilari saw humans as a rising threat, a young species too ambitious, too unpredictable. It was better to bring them under control before they became dangerous. The decision was made. A fleet was dispatched to capture human test subjects, and soon, the first batch of prisoners arrived at a hidden Exilari research station. The scientists were eager to watch their masterpiece take effect once again, confident that within moments, the humans would fall under their command like every other species before them. Inside the sterile, dimly lit lab, Captain Elias Ward sat restrained in a metal chair, his piercing eyes scanning the room with quiet defiance. He was not alone. Several other humans sat beside him, each restrained, each awaiting their fate. The lead Exilari scientist, a tall, insectoid being with deep violet skin, approached with a syringe filled with the shimmering blue serum. It was almost laughable, he thought. These humans had no idea what was coming. With practiced ease, he injected the first subject and waited. Seconds passed. Then, minutes. The Exilari scientist frowned. The human did not show any signs of compliance. No blank stare, no loss of resistance. Instead, his breathing grew steady, his eyes sharper. He looked at his captors, not with submission, but with a strange, knowing expression, as if he could see something they could not. Alarmed, the scientist ordered a higher dose. But the moment the enhanced serum entered the human's bloodstream, something terrifying happened. The human let out a slow breath, as if something deep within him had awakened. Then, he turned his head toward the scientist and smiled. It was not a smile of fear. It was a smile of understanding. Confusion spread through the research team as they checked their instruments. The serum was working, neurons were firing, brain waves were shifting, but not in the way they expected. Instead of suppressing thoughts, the serum was amplifying them. The human's mind was not shutting down, it was accelerating. Captain Elias Ward had seen enough. His body trembled, but not in fear. A storm of clarity surged through his mind. He could feel the presence of the Exilari scientists, not just see them, but sense them. It was as if their intentions, their emotions, their very thoughts were laid bare before him. He looked to his fellow prisoners and saw the same realization dawn on their faces. The serum had not enslaved them. It had unlocked something within them. The Exilari, still unaware of what was happening, continued the experiment, injecting more humans. Panic gripped the scientists as they watched every single human exhibit the same reaction. Resistance. Heightened awareness. Mental barriers stronger than anything the Exilari had encountered before. One scientist, overwhelmed by the tension in the room, attempted to send a distress signal, but before he could reach the console, a sudden, invisible force stopped him. His limbs locked in place. His breath caught in his throat. One of the humans had simply looked at him, and in that moment, he felt his own will slip away. A terrifying thought crept into the Exilari's collective mind. Their perfect serum had not only failed, it had turned into a weapon against them. Ward and his fellow humans, now fully aware of their new abilities, exchanged glances. They could hear the whispers of their captors' minds, feel their panic like ripples in the air. The Exilari had sought to break them, to erase their free will. Instead, they had sharpened it to an unimaginable degree. The humans were no longer just individuals. They were connected, linked by something beyond the Exilari's understanding. And now, they had an advantage. Slowly, one by one, they began testing the limits of their abilities. One human focused on a scientist, making the alien doubt his own memories. Another turned his attention to a security officer, planting a suggestion so subtle the alien never realized it wasn't his own idea. The room, once filled with arrogant captors and powerless prisoners, was now shifting. The Exilari were losing control, and they didn't even know it yet. The lead scientist, trembling with disbelief, realized the gravity of their mistake. They had assumed that humans would break like every other species. They had assumed that their minds were weak, that they could be controlled. But humans were different. Their minds fought back. And now, they were evolving right before the Accelerary's eyes. Desperation set in. The scientist reached for the emergency containment button, but his vision blurred. He could feel something creeping into his mind, something foreign yet powerful. His own thoughts twisted, his memories flickered. He stumbled back, gasping. One of the humans, Elias Ward, was staring directly at him, his gaze sharp, unwavering. And for the first time in his long career, the scientist felt what it was like to be controlled. Alarms blared throughout the facility as chaos erupted. The XLRs scrambled to regain order, but it was too late. The humans had already seized control not through weapons, not through brute force, but through something far more terrifying. Their minds were now stronger than anything the Accelerary had ever encountered. And for the first time in history, the empire known for bending others to its will was facing a species that could not be controlled. The realization sent a wave of fear through the Accelerary ranks. They had created the perfect mind control serum, and now they were trapped with the one species that could turn it against them. Panic spread through the Accelerary research facility as the impossible unfolded before their eyes. The mind control serum, their empire's greatest weapon, had worked on every species before, but not on humans. Instead of bending to their will, the humans had become something else. The serum had not erased their thoughts, it had sharpened them, strengthened them. Captain Elias Ward could feel it coursing through his veins, his mind expanding in ways he could not fully understand yet. He could sense the Accelerary's fear, not just through their frantic movements, but in a way that went beyond sight and sound. It was as if their emotions had weight pressing against the air, making them easy to read. His fellow prisoners felt it too. Their senses were heightened, their perception sharper than ever before. The Accelerary had no idea what they had unleashed. The lead scientist, a high-ranking Accelerary named Vorlix, struggled to contain his growing dread. He had seen the serum break the wills of entire species, turning warlords into loyal subjects with just a single injection. But now, he was witnessing something entirely different. The humans were supposed to be mindless drones by now, stripped of their resistance, following commands without question. Instead, they were watching him with unsettling awareness, their expressions calm, almost amused. Vorlix ordered another dose, convinced that increasing the potency would overpower them. The serum was meant to suppress thoughts, to erase individuality. Perhaps humans required a stronger concentration. His assistants hurried to inject more of the shimmering blue liquid into the human test subjects, their hands shaking as they worked. But the moment the enhanced serum entered their bloodstream, Elias felt his pulse slow, his thoughts becoming eerily clear. He could feel something shifting within him, as if invisible barriers in his mind were breaking apart, allowing him to see beyond what his eyes could perceive. It was not just an awareness of the Accelerary's fear, it was something deeper. He could sense their thoughts, fragmented and frantic, as if they were being projected into the air around him. He turned his gaze to Vorlix, and in that instant, the Accelerary scientist gasped, clutching his head. Images flashed before Elias's eyes, memories that did not belong to him. He saw the experiments, the countless species reduced to obedient slaves, the cold efficiency with which the Accelerary had ruled. It was as if he had reached into Vorlix's mind and pulled the knowledge straight from his consciousness. The Accelerary recoiled in horror. Their perfect serum had not just failed, it had transformed its subjects. The humans were no longer just immune to their control, they were evolving into something beyond their understanding. Elias glanced at his fellow prisoners and saw the same realization dawn upon them. They could feel each other's presence, sense each other's emotions without speaking. It was not mind control. It was something far more powerful. The serum had unlocked something within them, something the Accelerary had never encountered before. And now, they were no longer captives. They were something else entirely. The tension in the room thickened as the Accelerary guards raised their weapons, but before they could fire, the lights flickered. The security systems, designed to keep prisoners contained, began malfunctioning. The humans had not even moved, yet the facility was already turning against its masters. The guards hesitated, glancing at each other, confusion written across their faces. Vorlich shouted orders, but his voice lacked its usual authority. His own scientists looked at him with uncertainty, their belief in the serum shattered. The foundation of XLRE power had been mind control. But now, they were facing a species that had not only resisted, but had become something they could not predict or control. Elias took a step forward, and the guards flinched, their fingers twitching over their triggers. But he did not need to attack. He could feel their hesitation, their uncertainty. It was as if their thoughts were laid bare before him, and with a single glance, he pushed against their doubts. The effect was immediate. One of the guards lowered his weapon, confusion clouding his expression. Another took a step back, as if realizing, for the first time, that they were on the wrong side of history. The XLRE had relied on their ability to dominate others for so long that they had never considered what would happen if they lost that power. And now, they were beginning to understand the cost of their arrogance. Vorlich, trembling, activated the emergency distress signal. He needed reinforcements, needed to contain this mistake before it spread. But as he reached for the controls, his hand froze in midair. Not because of physical force, but because of something deeper. He could feel a presence pressing against his thoughts, an unseen force holding him still. His breath quickened as he realized what was happening. The humans were not just immune to the serum. They had become something more, something that could reach into his mind just as easily as he had once manipulated others. His own weapon had turned against him. The humans, once captives, were now in control. The XLRE had spent centuries perfecting their mind control technology, ensuring their dominance over the galaxy. But in their arrogance, they had made a critical mistake. They had assumed that humanity was just another species to be conquered, another civilization to be bent to their will. Instead, they had given them the one thing no empire should ever give its enemies: an evolution beyond control. The facility, once a symbol of XLRE superiority, was now a battleground of shifting power. The guards, overwhelmed by fear, hesitated to engage. The scientists, once confident in their absolute control, were now questioning everything they knew. And the humans, no longer mere prisoners, stood at the center of it all, their minds awakened, their abilities growing stronger by the second. The XLRE had sought to enslave them. Instead, they had unleashed something they could never hope to contain. And as Elias Ward turned his gaze upon the trembling scientist before him, one thing became clear: the age of XLRE domination was coming to an end. The halls of the XLRE command station echoed with silence, but it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of fear, the kind that crept into the minds of those who had ruled unchallenged for centuries. The humans had been a simple experiment, another species to be brought under control like all the others before them. But now, everything was unraveling. The XLRE had not just failed to dominate humanity, they had created something far worse. The rebellion had not started with weapons or warships. It had started within their own minds. The serum, once the ultimate tool of control, had given the humans an ability the XLRE could not understand. It had turned them into something more. Captain Elias Ward walked through the corridors, his steps slow, deliberate. His mind stretched beyond his own body, sensing the emotions of those around him: fear, confusion, desperation. He could hear the unspoken thoughts of the guards standing at their posts, their hands gripping their weapons too tightly. They'd been trained to obey without question, but now, doubt had taken root in their minds. The XLRE had never faced an enemy that could see their fears, that could reach into their thoughts and shift them like pieces on a game board. And Elias knew that doubt was more powerful than any weapon. The rebellion had already begun, and the XLRE didn't even realize it. Across the station, humans who had once been prisoners were awakening, their minds sharper, their awareness expanding. They no longer needed words to communicate. A single glance was enough. The moment the serum had failed to suppress their will, it had done the opposite: it had connected them. They were no longer isolated individuals fighting against an overwhelming enemy. They were something greater. A network. A force that could not be stopped. And now, they were inside the heart of the Empire's control center. Vorlix, the XLRE scientist who had first overseen the experiment, stood in the command room, staring at the data screens with wide, unblinking eyes. Numbers and signals flashed across the displays, but none of them made sense. Communications were failing, security systems were malfunctioning, and worst of all, his own soldiers were hesitating. It was happening faster than he had feared. The humans were not attacking with physical force, yet their presence was spreading like an infection. The XLRE prided themselves on controlling the thoughts of others, but now something was pushing back. It was subtle, like a whisper in the back of the mind, a quiet suggestion that made a soldier question his orders, made an officer hesitate before reporting to his superior. At first, it was barely noticeable. Then, it spread. Elias reached the security checkpoint, where 3 XLRE guards blocked his path. They did not fire. They should have, but something held them back. Elias didn't need to speak. He could feel their uncertainty, their struggle between obedience and fear. He stepped closer, locking eyes with the lead guard. The alien's grip on his weapon tightened, his breath unsteady. And then, without a single word being exchanged, the guard took a step back. His comrades glanced at him in shock, but the hesitation was contagious. One by one, they lowered their weapons, uncertain of why they were doing it, only that something deep inside them told them resistance was futile. The rebellion was not fought with guns or warships. It was fought with ideas, with doubt. The moment the XLRE began to question their own strength, they had already lost. Across the station, more and more XLRE soldiers found themselves frozen in indecision. Orders were given, but they were slow to be followed. Elias and his people moved freely through the corridors, unchallenged, untouched. The XLRE were beginning to understand what was happening, but it was already too late. Their empire had thrived on absolute obedience. Without it, they were nothing. Vorlix slammed his fist against the console, his mind racing. He needed to act now, before the entire station fell under human control. With trembling hands, he activated the emergency override, sealing off sections of the facility, cutting off power to key areas. If he could isolate them. Humans, maybe he could stop whatever was happening. But as he issued the commands, he felt something strange. His own fingers hesitated over the controls. His own thoughts wavered, as if something foreign had slipped into his mind. His breath caught in his throat. No, it wasn't possible. He was the one in control. He was the master of this station. And yet the door to the command center slid open, and Elias stepped inside. He did not carry a weapon. He didn't need one. The XLRE officers inside turned to face him, their expressions shifting from anger to confusion to something deeper, something closer to fear. They had spent their entire lives bending others to their will. Now, they were the ones being bent. Elias looked at Vorlix, the once proud scientist who had thought of humans as nothing more than test subjects. He could feel the alien's desperation, his struggle to maintain control. But it was slipping. "You feel it, don't you?" Elias said, his voice calm, almost gentle. The doubt, the fear, the uncertainty. He took another step forward, and Vorlix stumbled back. The other XLRE officers glanced at each other, uncertain of what to do. You ruled because you controlled minds. But what happens when your own mind turns against you? Vorlix wanted to fight back, wanted to order his soldiers to strike. But the words never left his lips. His own people were hesitating, their loyalty crumbling. Elias had not threatened them. He had not harmed them. He had simply been there. And that was enough. Across the station, the XLRE's hold was breaking. Guards were abandoning their posts. Officers were questioning their orders. The rebellion was not loud. It was not violent. It was quiet, creeping, unstoppable. It was not a war of weapons. It was a war of the mind. And the XLRE had already lost. The battlefield was nothing like the XLRE had expected. For centuries, their war doctrine had been built on a simple, undeniable truth: they controlled everything. Their fleets moved with precision. Their armies followed orders without question, and their enemies fell before they could even think of resisting. But now, something was different. The war was no longer going as planned. The humans had changed everything. It wasn't their weapons that frightened the Exilari, nor their warships. It was something far more terrifying, something that had taken root within the very minds of the Empire itself. The war had taken a turn, and the Exilari were no longer the ones in control. Fleet Commander Xira stood aboard the bridge of the Dominion's flagship, staring at the holographic battlefield before her. The human fleet should have been overwhelmed by now. They were smaller, fewer in number, lacking the advanced technology that had made the Exilari an unbeatable force for generations. And yet, despite all logic, they were winning. Ships that should have been destroyed were still maneuvering, dodging incoming fire with impossible precision. Enemy pilots anticipated Exilari attacks before they even happened, reacting as if they could see the future. Entire Exilari squadrons broke formation mid-battle, their pilots hesitating, their minds clouded with doubt. It made no sense until Xira realized the terrifying truth. The humans were not just fighting with weapons. They were fighting with thoughts. Captain Elias Ward watched from the command deck of his own ship, his mind calm even as the battle raged outside. He could feel the Exilari fleet struggling, their rigid discipline breaking apart under pressure. The serum that had once been meant to enslave humanity had instead given them something no empire could ever counter-awareness beyond the physical. The humans did not just fight with strategy and skill. They fought with intuition, with instincts that went beyond the limits of normal warfare. They did not need to see their enemies to know where they would strike. They could sense them. The Exilari had always ruled through domination, forcing others to bend to their will, stripping them of independent thought. But now, that very strength had become their weakness. Elias and his people had turned their greatest weapon against them. The battle was shifting, not because of firepower, but because of something much deeper. The Exilari were beginning to doubt. Orders were issued but not followed. Pilots hesitated before firing. Soldiers questioned their commands. The certainty that had held the Empire together for centuries was now crumbling, and in war, hesitation was death. Sierra clenched her fists as another Exilari warship was lost, its crew failing to coordinate in time to escape enemy fire. This was impossible. The humans were still outnumbered, still technologically inferior. And yet, it no longer mattered. The Exilari fleet was breaking apart, not because of the enemy's strength, but because of their own weakness. The humans had found a way into their minds, unraveling their discipline from the inside. Elias exhaled slowly, focusing on the unseen energy flowing through him. He could feel his people, their thoughts linked in a way that no species had ever experienced before. They were not individuals fighting alone. They were a single force, connected by something stronger than words or strategy. The Exilari had ruled by controlling thoughts, but now they were the ones being influenced. And the war was turning in humanity's favor. The Exilari capital ship fired its main cannon, a blast powerful enough to destroy an entire fleet. But before the energy beam could strike, the human ships moved. Not in a scattered, desperate retreat, but in perfect synchronization, as if they had known the attack was coming before it had even been fired. The beam passed through empty space, hitting nothing. The Exilari gunners hesitated. How had they predicted that? How had they known exactly where not to be? Fear spread through the Exilari fleet like wildfire, and suddenly, their perfect military machine was falling apart. Sierra knew what had to be done. She had spent her life fighting, crushing rebellion after rebellion before it could take hold. But this was different. This was not an uprising of weak species trying to resist inevitable conquest. This was something else. The humans were no longer fighting for survival. They were evolving. And if the Exilari did not find a way to stop them now, they never would. She turned to her officers, her voice sharp. Fall back. Now. The order sent shockwaves through the fleet. The Exilari never retreated. They had never needed to. And yet, this was no longer a war they could win through brute force. If they stayed, they would be annihilated, not because of the enemy's firepower, but because of something they could not even begin to understand. As the Exilari ships turned away from the battlefield, Elias and his crew watched them go, knowing the truth that the Empire was only just beginning to realize. The war was no longer about weapons or numbers. It was about control. And the XLR had lost IT.AS. The last XLR ships vanished into the void. Elias closed his eyes, feeling the presence of his people, their minds united in a way no species had ever achieved before. The war was far from over, but something fundamental had changed. The humans were no longer just survivors. They were something greater, something unstoppable. And for the first time in history, the XLR feared the future. The war had taken a turn. And it was only the beginning. The XLR had always believed in absolute control. Their empire stretched across countless star systems, built upon the broken will of lesser species. They had enslaved, conquered, and dominated without question for centuries. No race had ever stood against them and survived. Until now. Until humanity. What had once been an insignificant species, barely capable of interstellar travel, had become something else, something the XLR could not control, could not break. The war had begun as just another campaign of subjugation, but now it had spiraled into something far more dangerous. The XLR were not just losing a battle. They were facing the rise of an unbreakable species, a force that could not be crushed, a people who refused to kneel. Captain Elias Ward stood at the center of the human flagship's command deck, his mind calm despite the chaos unfolding in the void beyond. The war had changed, and so had humanity. The XLR had tried to break them, had tried to use their own technology to suppress their will, to turn them into obedient servants like so many others before. But their plan had failed. Instead of enslaving them, the XLR had unlocked something in humanity that no one, not even the humans themselves, had known was possible. They had become more than just soldiers, more than just survivors. They had become connected. Their minds, once isolated and vulnerable, had fused into something greater, a shared awareness that no other species had ever possessed. They did not need words to communicate, did not need orders to act. They knew each other's thoughts, felt each other's intentions, and that made them unstoppable. Across the battlefield, the XLR fleet struggled to maintain order. Their once unshakable formations were crumbling, their disciplined forces faltering. Orders were given, but hesitation spread through their ranks like a virus. Their pilots were experiencing something new, something terrifying: doubt. The humans were not fighting like any enemy they had ever faced. They moved as one, their ships weaving through enemy fire with impossible precision. They countered attacks before they even happened, reacting as if they could see the battle before it unfolded. The XLR prided themselves on controlling the battlefield, but now it was slipping from their grasp. For the first time in history, they were losing. High Commander watched in disbelief from the bridge of her warship. She had fought in countless campaigns, crushed rebellions before they could take root, wiped out entire civilizations without hesitation. But this was different. The humans were not just resisting. They were winning. And they were doing it in a way that defied everything she understood about war. The XLR had underestimated them, had assumed they would break like all the others. But humanity had not broken. They had adapted, evolved. And now they were something else entirely. The XLR's greatest strength had always been their ability to dominate the minds of others, to bend their enemies to their will. But the humans could fight back. Solari soldiers found themselves hesitating, their thoughts clouded with uncertainty. For centuries, they had followed orders without question. Now, those orders felt wrong. It was as if something was pushing back against their very minds, something invisible yet overwhelming. They could not see the human's weapon, but they could feel it. It was not fear. It was something far worse. It was the realization that they were not in control anymore. Elias exhaled slowly, feeling the thoughts of his crew, their emotions and intentions flowing together as one. This was no longer just a war. It was a transformation. The XLR had thought themselves invincible, but they had never faced an enemy like this before. Humanity had become something new, something beyond the XLR's ability to control. They were no longer fighting as individuals. They were fighting as one mind, and nothing could stop them. The Acceleri fleet began to break apart, their forces retreating in desperation. But they could not escape what was coming. This was not just the loss of a battle. It was the collapse of their empire's foundation, the end of their era of dominance. The humans were no longer just a rebellious species fighting for survival. They were rising, and nothing in the galaxy could stand in their way. Sira clenched her fists, knowing the truth even before the battle was over. The war had changed. The balance of power had shifted. Humanity was no longer just another species to be conquered. They were something far more dangerous. They were the future, and the Acceleri were doomed.